Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds, featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I am your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations and to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Maybe you've been listening for a while, or this is your first episode. If you like what you hear, would you do us a favor by rating and reviewing us on iTunes? This is a fantastic way to tell us you enjoy what we are creating. Also, if you want more MTSS resources, sign up for our weekly newsletter using the link in our show notes, and check out our website for all the blogs and guides you would ever need about MTSS. Universal screeners aren't just for academics, but they can help schools support students with social and emotional needs. So today, we are going to dig into some of those tough questions about social emotional screening, and we have two experts here with us today to answer these tough questions and teach us more about how to use these types of screeners to support students. So I want to welcome Dr. Essie Sutton, an applied developmental psychologist and our director of learning science here at Branching Minds, and Trudy Bender, who is a former school psychologist and our senior manager of thought leadership. They have a lot to share, and I'm so excited to ask them these big questions, and I designed them to be extra tough because I know that they have great answers. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about the benefits of universal screening over teacher referral, because I think a lot of times we hear this, or I see this question a lot online, about how do we navigate when a teacher knows that there's something up with a kid and they want to refer them to the MTSS process. But what's then the benefit of having a universal screener within that process?
I can get us started, and then Trudy, you can add your thoughts as well or mention anything that I forget. But so with universal screening, you're really assessing all students. That's kind of the key aspect, is you're using some kind of standardized measure to really look at and assess the behaviors and the social emotional skills of all students within your population. So the benefits of using a screener over just relying on teacher referral is that it makes the process a lot more systematic, because you are having teachers really consider the behavioral skills, strengths, and needs across all of their students. Teacher referrals, they're not completely inaccurate, but they are more likely to be biased. And it can take a lot longer for student behavior to get to the point where there is a referral. So you're kind of waiting a lot longer to actually intervene. And you're also, might be missing some really challenging behaviors that might not be as obvious. So when it comes to teacher referral, you tend to get a lot of students with really extreme behavioral issues, defiance, bullying, things like that. But there are other behaviors that teachers need to be aware of as well. Things like internalizing symptoms, extreme shyness, anxiety, sadness. So you want to make sure you're using a screening tool that really assesses all those types of behaviors.
Yeah, that's really been my experience as well. So if we don't use a screener when it comes to things like social emotional skills and behavior, you're going to end up just working with the kids who have big aggressive, behaviors, or they're running out of the classroom. Those kids are going to get all of the resources, and they need help for sure. But it's that kid who's lonely and withdrawn in the back row that gets missed. They're not causing any immediate trouble, but that's the kid that really needs some close interaction, some intervention to help build relationships, help them feel more connected to school. And it is a safety issue for all of us. I mean, those are the kids who can actually be a real danger to all of us. And so it's really important that we catch those quiet children who are also struggling in this area, and universal screeners can help you do that.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. It is oftentimes that the teachers are most concerned with the ones that are louder, understandably. Those are the ones that prevent you
Understandably,
from
right?
getting
Yeah.
teaching done. And I think the ones that are
Mhm.
quiet and fly under the radar, those are the ones I think a lot about.
Mhm.
Just the ones who are struggling and that we don't know that they're struggling. And there's kids that learn how to mask quickly. They
Yeah.
learn how to hide some of that stuff. So I think that that's really important. So, I mean, when we talk about universal screeners, there's some just essential questions that I think people bring up a lot. And one of them is about parent and guardian consent or family consent for this involvement. Because when you're talking about a screener, a social emotional one, that seems like a really personal kind of information. So, what would you say to schools about how to present a universal screener for social, emotional, and behavior? And then how do you kind of improve that family engagement throughout the process? Essie, I'm just going to go ahead and throw it to you.
Yeah, it's a really big part of it, and we get a ton of questions about this, and we work with districts all over the country. So some of that really depends on the regulations and the laws and the standards within the state or within the district. So there, you have to kind of pay close attention to that. At which point do you require parent consent? When is it kind of opt out versus opt in? All of those things can vary. But I will say, in my experience, the more transparent you are with parents and guardians, the better. When you're starting to hide things or, only talk about them very vaguely, I think that's when parents get kind of upset and maybe suspicious, or they think that something's going on at the school that's not. And I think a lot of parents would be surprised if they actually looked at the content of a lot of these screeners and they realize the questions are really not that intrusive. They're pretty basic questions about student behavior. So I think the more kind of upfront and transparent you're willing to be, um, the better.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think if you can really just open the book on what you're asking and make it really clear that no one is compelled, like if a student doesn't feel comfortable answering a question, they are not compelled to answer that particular question. And it's really just about trying to get ahead of possible issues and help kids be successful in school. And so, most families are going to be really happy and wanting to partner to make sure that their kids are getting the support that they need. So, but you can't treat parents as though you're somehow on opposite sides of the table and trying to. You really want to welcome parents into that process and make sure that you're transparent about what's happening.
Well, yes, I would agree. The more transparent that you are with parents and upfront, I think that in itself will likely
Mhm.
address more issues than if you delay communication. And I just feel like that communication to parents prior to when you introduce it to kids is important because I think kids will sometimes bring home their own narrative, that because they have their own perception and narrative
Yeah.
about something. And you don't want to put the kids in between the school and parents. And so I think that's pretty important. So I love that. I mean, and that's one of the
Mhm.
primary questions. But so when you talk to administrators or even think about training administrators on some of this stuff, how would leaders help make sure that the ratings of some of these screeners are fair and unbiased? Because I know that there's some teacher screeners that the teachers complete them versus the students. And I would think maybe, especially if you're teachers that want to avoid having those difficult students in your class, I can imagine that maybe that might skew your perception a little bit. And so, how do we help leaders navigate that?
Well, I can start on this one. I think that there is always going to be some subjectivity in a rating scale like this. Like that's inevitable. However, having a standardized tool rather than just relying on referral, just that right off the bat helps take some of the bias out. And you do have teachers with really different approaches overall to behavior and discipline. So some teachers are hesitant to indicate any problems, to write discipline referrals, to, indicate on a screening because they feel like it reflects poorly back on their own classroom management or the way that they're interacting with their students. And so when you look across screening results, you can often see some teachers are hardly indicating any issues, and then other teachers are indicating that almost all of their students have behavior issues. Like you can just really, or social emotional issues. So you can see that there's a lot of variation between how teachers handle this kind of thing. So having some really clear guidelines around screening, also around the way you write discipline referrals, what's reportable, what isn't, how we handle things, like having some really clear guidelines, like this is the way that we manage this in our school, using a good standardized tool that has a really clear rubric that goes with it, training your teachers on how to be objective with their students can help eliminate some of that bias. And maybe, Essie, you have more to add about this, how to help teachers eliminate some of that bias that can happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think, making sure that there's some training, there's clear communication, and we talked about that with parents, but there needs to be clear communication with teachers. If they are the ones completing these assessments, they need to understand the purpose, the why, how is the data going to be used. We're not using these results to remove kids from your classroom. So, just being very upfront and clear around kind of the intentions and the purpose behind the assessments and how the data is going to be used um, is is so important. So there's kind of like the setup that can help reduce some of those biases. And then there's also having the ability and having a process in place to review the data in a way that you can identify potential issues with bias, like what Trudy was saying, in classrooms where you have all of the students being, rated as having, severe behavioral or being at risk. That's a red flag if you have a classroom with that. It's a red flag even if it's true and valid. That's obviously a big issue. That's something that needs to be handled at the class level, but it's also could be a sign that you have a teacher that's really stressed out, that a teacher that needs support. So I think it's really important to have that in place to be able to see if there are any issues with biases. And same goes for looking at, patterns and results around student race, ethnicity, language, all those different kind of demographic characteristics. You want to be able to really look at the data and see if there are patterns where, oh, wait a minute, we see this group of students, they're, all getting rated in a certain way. We want to kind of dig into that a bit more and see what the issue might be. So it's really about having that kind of access to the data in a certain way that allows you to be aware of bias. Because what Trudy said is true. Like, you're going to have some bias, like it's going to exist. You will always have some teachers that, rate students a certain way and some teachers that rate students a different way. And you have to just kind of be aware of it and be able to kind of understand it and track it. And, it needs to be a part of your practice of reviewing the data.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I have experience of reviewing screening data where you would see teachers who had almost all of their students indicated like with, really big behavior challenges. And what you said, Essie, is true. That's a red flag. Even if it's true, and it might be, like sometimes really great teachers will have all of the kind of tough kids with a lot of challenges poured into their classroom because they know that they can manage it. And so, just taking a look over those ratings can really provide information about what your teachers are going through as well, to make sure that they're getting the support that they need. And if a teacher is reporting a problem, they need help, whether that is an accurate assessment, and often it is, or if there's some kind of bias or something else going on there. It's really important to try to provide that support and to see what's going on, and digging down. And it's really common actually to look at screening data and see some patterns. So for example, you might see that the boys in your school are showing more aggressive behavior. The girls in your school might be showing more withdrawal or anxious behavior. Like, you see these kind of patterns going through, and it gives you the ability to look across your population and say, all right, what kind of additional support do we need here? Is there something that we can do with our structure and the way we're providing direct instruction to our students, and also structuring the school day to provide what they need, offering a lot of social interaction opportunities. I mean, one of the things we see in schools today is that schools are taking action to have cell phone free zones, so the kids are interacting with each other in a more normal way. Like, there's a lot of things that schools can do when they understand that there's an issue going on. And so some of that is going to come out here in universal screening. It's also going to come out in other kinds of surveys, like student surveys, parent surveys, staff surveys, where they just directly provide their perception on what's happening. So that goes a little bit beyond the bias question, but it's just the importance of seeing where patterns are, because when you can kind of predict that this is where problems are occurring, you can often do something to prevent it or to try to intervene.
And I'll just add too, because we talked mostly about teacher reported assessments, but in terms of assessments where students are reporting on their own kind of social emotional skills, behaviors, you know, it's the kind of the same thing. Like you want to be very clear around why we're having you do the survey, how the data is going to be used. Like, no, you're not going to be in trouble for, you know, your answers, and this is not a test. That was a big one. I mean, because I, you know, for years I did research in schools, and a lot of that was doing surveys with students. And a big thing, you know, we have to tell them, like, because they're so used to taking tests all the time, this is not a test. There's no right or wrong answer. We are just looking for, you know, your answer might be different from your neighbors, so don't copy what other people are writing down. But that's, you know, all those things are really important. And, you know, we sometimes get questions, differences between teacher report and student report and what should we use. And there is a lot of research looking at, you know, which one's more reliable and valid. And it really comes down to kind of what you're measuring. Teacher reports are probably the most accurate in terms of predicting kind of long-term outcomes for students. And I think that's because teachers, you know, they spend the most amount of time with students in the context of schools and classrooms. They also see so many different students. So they're really kind of able to have that sense of like what's the norm versus what's not the norm. So teacher reporting, sometimes people ask that, like, how accurate is it to have our teachers, you know, teachers are in general, I would say, quite good reporters when it comes to student behavior. Students can also be good at reporting on their own skills, especially things that we're not able to observe. So some of those kind of internalizing things that maybe teachers wouldn't see. And also as students get older, their reports get more kind of reliable and valid. So and that's not to say that younger students are not aware of these things, but just the measures that we use to collect the data, it can be harder for younger students to understand them. So, but you know, it's important to be aware of these things when using both teacher report and student report.
Yeah, I don't know if you ever had this experience, Essie, but in doing some of this kind of work, I would have teachers sometimes ask, you know, am I allowed to explain something to the student about the item if they don't understand? I'm like, of course you are. Like we want to provide
Yeah.
an accurate answer. And of course you can explain this. Again, it's not a test. We're trying to get an accurate picture of the student's perception. So please explain that.
Yes, and being able to explain like what these words mean. We had like standard definitions because this was all like in a research study, so we had to be very standardized about how we helped students. But like we had these kind of standard definitions for the common types of questions that students would ask.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's true because teachers are used to like not being able to help their students during a test.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't help you with that. Just do the best you can.
Yeah.
And I think something that you both brought up and mentioned is that idea of the purpose behind the data, right? Having that perception of how is this data being used? Even I think that can help with teacher bias a little bit, with the understanding that we're collecting this information in order to not only help individual students, but also have a bigger picture of how things are going school-wide. Because I think there's a little bit of that thinking that we don't want to use this in the wrong way, but really just giving teachers and students an understanding of what is this data going to be used for. And I think I've heard this before, that the more that they understand the purpose, the more accurate that information will be, because I think that's why students sometimes struggle with assessments and standardized assessments, because they question, how is this data really going to help? What's it really used for? And I think that's really important to explain, especially when I think especially to middle grade students, middle school and high school, as they sort of get to that either I don't care or they just not care about things. It's really important for them to understand that purpose. So speaking of when you look at that data and when you see large groups of students maybe struggling and needing intervention, what do they do with that now? What are some of the recommendations for schools when they see that big group of students that really is struggling? with this kind of issue and needing this more support with social and emotional behavior, what would you say? Where would you say that they should start with those kind of results?
Well, I think this is a really common problem, actually, is that we screen our students and then we become overwhelmed with the needs, whether that's academic needs or behavioral needs or social emotional needs. Like, this is a really common thing to have happen. And I love what you just shared, Larissa, about making sure that you've made it clear what the purpose is behind collecting this data. And sometimes we take a lot of time and effort and resources to collect data that we have no plan for what we're going to do with that data. And we maybe haven't even provided some formats and training for our teams on what to do with that data. So one of the things that I've worked with is a protocol for how to have a data dialogue. Like, how do we take this data now and look at it in a way that's going to be productive, and giving teams those tools so that right from the get-go, before they're even collecting this data, they know that there's going to be a process for actually using this data and helping it inform their decisions. When it comes to being overwhelmed, the temptation can be to basically change your cut points and just say, well, we can't help that many students, so we're just going to help the very top that are tearing up our school, and we don't know, like, we have to do something about this, so we'll do that, but we'll just kind of try to deal with the rest of it later because you feel overwhelmed. And I certainly understand that impulse. However, when you do that, often you're not providing the proactive support that can bring that whole level of overall need down. So, for example, if you're overwhelmed with like big, dangerous, challenging behavior and you put all of your effort there, you're often not stopping the source of that or providing some intervention for the source of that through some easier to provide, more standardized interventions that can help a lot of students. If you can get some of those targeted interventions in place for those kids who just have mild to moderate issues and catch those kind of early and start providing some intervention for those, you can prevent those bigger problems from ever happening in the first place. Or at the very least, you can reserve some resources because you're not trying to just scattershot it everywhere. You have an organized system where you can then provide some direct and really intensive interventions for the kids who need it. And then, of course, pulling all the way back to your tier one kind of universal supports that you're providing. And it can be so challenging when you feel like you don't have the resources or the staff or whatever to really go after those issues. But even taking some small steps toward universal support and prevention can make such a big difference. Just to decide, all right, we recognize that we're really struggling with whatever that issue might be in our school, whatever kind of social skill it might be, or whatever that behavioral issue might be. Let's pick something and let's take one small step to try to get ahead of this problem, and let's go after it. And often you find if you can take even that one small focused step on one issue, that other things start to get better as well. And you can kind of get this cycle of improvement going. What would you add to that, Essie? I know you would have a lot to add.
That was all great. I don't know what else I have to add, but I definitely just echo everything you said. Like, really make sure that you're making those kind of, even if they're small steps to those different, maybe not as severe levels of support, but at least getting in there and doing some of that kind of prevention work. Usually when you have a lot of students with severe behavioral issues, you really have to kind of go back to your tier one and see, like, what can we be doing at the classroom level that's going to support all of our students? What are classroom practices? If there's a program or some kind of training you can provide to teachers, something that we can provide all students, because this is not just, an issue for a small group of students. This affects everyone. So I think kind of going back to tier one and seeing, if we're a PBIS school, are we actually using those practices at the classroom level? Are they being implemented with fidelity? Um, and then the other thing I'll add is just, we have a lot of districts now that are really partnering with or other companies or organizations or kind of community partners to really help them with the behavioral, social, emotional, mental health issues that they're struggling with. So it might be that you don't have the capacity within your school or the resources within your school to support all students, but it could be that there are other organizations that can help you with that work. We have a lot of districts now that are using doing like virtual small group or individual counseling or social skills or things like that. So you can really think outside of the box when it comes to supporting students. It doesn't have to just be, well, we don't have, or we have one social worker, therefore, we can only support 10 students this semester. There are other options out there. So I think part of it is really being aware of kind of all the all the
Yeah,
options.
I had a kind of a practical example of one place that I saw this work, which was a school that did have a lot of big behavior struggles with their students, and they were recognizing that their students didn't have good skills for making friends and keeping friends. They didn't understand conflict resolution, and so they did they worked with a second step curriculum. They implemented some universal social skills lessons, but then they targeted their playground. And they decided this is the place where we're seeing a lot of fighting issues, and so they had more structured recess time where they, first of all, they allowed the students a little bit more time to play. So they built into their schedule more time for it. And then they provided some structure for kids who were truly struggling. So for most, for the kids that were doing fine, they let them do fine. But they had an actual recess intervention, more structured so that they could get, here's how you play, here's how you take turns, like actually teaching children how to play, which you just think, oh my goodness, don't children know how to play? But sometimes kids actually don't. Like they have not developed
Yeah.
those skills. And so giving them that little bit of structure and then setting them loose to try it really made a difference. They also just changed the way that they were running their recess and put a lot of different structures in place, more supervision, more things for the kids to do to try to make that a time for kids to really develop those social skills. Made a big difference. And so when you feel overwhelmed, when you have far too many students, there are small steps that you can take. And I love what you said, Essie, about thinking outside the box. There are a lot of resources that if you broaden your scope to think, all right, as a city, like what is available to me or in my sphere or online, like what is available to me that we can start pulling in to try to meet the needs of our kids. So,
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I do think that recess probably looks different than it used to. I think in our own experience and maybe even students that with free play, and students are just very different. So I think that that's a fantastic idea because sometimes people just don't know how to take turns or what have you. So my last question is about the amount of screening. I know we've talked about students are tested a lot. They do have they experience all these kinds of things, but it is recommended that social emotional behavior screening be done 2 to 3 times a year. There may be some teachers out there or educators out there questioning this because we assess a lot. And they may say, do we really need to do all this again? So what would you say to that kind of question?
Well, I think it is a really important part of screening, that you're not just kind of doing it once and then forgetting about it. Like, it really helps build that muscle around, first of all, even just monitoring behavior and being aware of students' behavior. So I think it's important to have that kind of consistency. But it really allows you to see if the efforts and the work that you're doing, the interventions you're providing are having some kind of impact on a system level. So having that data across the school year really allows you to track change and growth, and perhaps make adjustments to kind of overall practices that may or may not be working. So it's important to kind of have that longitudinal data. If you wait till the next school year, like things can change a lot from one school year to the next. You have students leave, you have students kind of come in. Um, when you do screening at multiple times, you're able to kind of also capture those students who might not be in school for the whole year. So it is really beneficial, and it really allows you to kind of also take that time at different points throughout the school year to kind of look at system level. Okay, how are students doing? What's changed? What do we need to work on? I think it can be when you're just doing it, let's say like one time in the fall, you can almost like forget about it. Um, and something else that really is beneficial, I know people wonder like, what's the point of screening at the end of the school year? The student's about to leave. I had these students in my classroom. They're not going to be in my classroom next year. But we are working with a district now who's engaged in this practice where they are taking the end of the year behavior screening results, and they're using that to provide immediate support to students during the back to school transition, especially for those students that are transitioning from elementary to middle and middle to high school, where they tend to have a lot of issues. So really is a lot of use for that end of the year screening data and being able to kind of be extremely proactive and inform what's going to happen, like right when that student gets back to school, or which are the students we need to be paying attention to next year. We can, have the teachers kind of look at the data from the spring before. I think that's huge. So I think it's recommended for many screeners that you're doing it at least 2 times, if not 3 times across the school year is a really important process. And, a lot of these screeners do not take a lot of time. That's the other thing. If you are using a screening tool that is like taking teachers hours and hours, like, yes, then that is a problem. They should be extremely brief. So, I would say maximum like 3 to 5 minutes per student, if not less. So it really should not be a huge, huge time commitment for teachers or students.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it ties back to what you were saying, Essie, a lot about seeing the purpose for it in the first place. Like if teachers don't see what is happening with this data or that it's being used to inform anything, then why would we want to take the time to do it over and over again? But if you can see a clear purpose and you're actually trying to show, results from some of the interventions that you're doing and see some growth over time, most teachers are going to be more than willing to participate in that, especially if you make it easy. And I just so echo what you said, Essie, about making sure that this just takes, a 1-2 minutes, that it's super convenient and simple and accessible to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you both. I mean, I think this is really helpful for districts and schools that are trying to do some of this work. And I really appreciate you coming on and answering these questions, and maybe some of them were kind of tough, about universal screening for social, emotional, and behavior. And you both provided some really great ideas. So thank you so much for being here today. And I hope that we can be helpful to some of those people that are doing the work and that they're having a great school year.
Thank you. Thanks, Larissa.
Thanks for listening to Schoolin' Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. Go ahead and subscribe to our feed wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, if you are enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and lets us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn @Branching Minds.